At my dad's funeral, my sister stood up in front of the whole church, crying like she had carried his pain. Then she looked straight at me and said, "She never even let him meet his grandson." My heart stopped. I wanted to scream, but instead I walked to the front, handed the priest an envelope, and let my father's final letter do the talking. "Hi, I'm Emily," and for most of my life I was the daughter who stayed silent. But not anymore. Before we jump into the story, if you don't mind, let me know where you're from by leaving a comment below. That way, I can send a special hello your way. Now go ahead, grab yourself a warm cup of water and find a comfy spot. It's time to begin the story. My sister Rachel was always the golden child. She walked into a room and the conversation followed. I used to think maybe the air bent toward her, like sunflowers turning to face the light. Me? I held the coat. Or the camera. Someone had to take the picture. That Christmas, Dad's eyes kept drifting toward the front door. Every 10 minutes or so, he'd pretend to check the thermostat or stir something in the kitchen just to sneak another glance down the hallway. The wreath we hung together was still fresh, the cinnamon-scented pine cones wafting through the house like a memory he couldn't quite grab. "She said she won't make it," Mom announced from the living room, holding her phone up like it had testified in court. Something about flight delays and a last-minute client pitch. Poor thing, she's under so much pressure. I didn't say anything. James looked up from the couch and met my eyes, his brow furrowed, just a little. Then he went back to stringing popcorn on the thread I handed him. Rachel's absence was as loud as the choir music playing softly through the speakers. Every note of Silent Night just seemed to echo her name. We went through the motions, placing ornaments, sipping cider, pretending the empty space beside the tree wasn't meant for someone else. I hung the felt star I made in second grade near the top, and James helped me stretch to fix its angle. Dad chuckled behind us, but the sound thinned quickly. When we all stepped back to admire the tree, I noticed he'd placed an extra dinner plate at the end of the table, same spot as last year, and the year before that. After dinner, once the ham had been carved and the dishes cleared, Dad called me into the study. The fire was burning low, and the shadows danced gently across the spines of his books. He stood by the old desk we refinished together when I was 13, the one we scratched our initials into underneath, when Mom wasn't looking. "You have a minute?" he asked. His voice was soft, like the last page of a bedtime story. I nodded and sat across from him. He reached into the drawer, the one that always stuck, and pulled out a worn photo. It was the two of us, knee-deep in the river behind Uncle David's farm, holding up a tiny fish I'd caught. I must have been 7. My hair was wild and wet, and his arm was wrapped around my shoulder like I was the most valuable thing he'd ever pulled out of the water. "You remember that?" he asked. "I do," I said, smiling. "You've always been my anchor," he said, voice quieter now. "The one who stuck around." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just held the picture. The corners were frayed. I could still smell the wood polish and sunblock when I looked at it. He didn't say Rachel's name. He didn't have to. I hugged him before leaving the room. There was something fragile in the way his arms held me, like he didn't want to let go too quickly. Not because of love, but because of time. As I turned to leave, I saw it. In the corner of the drawer, an envelope, cream-colored, sealed neatly, and marked with small, careful handwriting. For later, T. It wasn't addressed to anyone. No date, no explanation. Just that. Later. I didn't ask, and he didn't mention it. I slipped it into my coat pocket before heading out. The paper felt oddly warm, like it had been waiting. On the ride home, James drove in silence while I watched the city lights pass in long blurs. The envelope sat in my lap. I traced the edge with my thumb but didn't open it. Not yet. Dad only asked for one thing for his 65th birthday, both his daughters at the same table. He only got one. Spring arrived early that year, as if North Carolina was trying to make up for all the gray weeks before. The yard smelled like magnolia and charcoal smoke. Dad had been up since 6, marinating ribs and humming to himself as he worked the smoker like it was a sacred art. "You don't have to do all this," I told him, handing over a stack of red and white checkered napkins. "Nonsense," he said, wiping his hands on an old dish towel. 65 only happens once." James helped me set up folding chairs in a half circle on the lawn, while I strung paper lanterns across the porch railing. Dad insisted on using the ones we bought years ago, the faded blue ones with little stars punched into them. He said they looked better when they'd aged, just like him. Linda was inside arranging the fruit salad in her crystal bowl when her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She picked it up, read the screen, and sighed like someone receiving an overdue invoice. "It's from Rachel," she said loud enough for me to hear. "She's stuck at a strategy session with a new investor. She sends her love." "Of course she does," I muttered, mostly to myself. Dad walked in carrying a tray of marinated vegetables and pretended not to hear. "Busy girl," he said softly, then added, "We'll save her a plate." We all knew she wasn't coming. Again. By 3 o'clock, the yard was full of polite laughter, coleslaw, and the smell of smoked meat. Neighbors dropped by with pies and good intentions. Dad moved slower than he used to, but his smile held as he shuffled between conversations. Linda poured sweet tea like it was her job. Every time someone asked about Rachel, her voice rose a little higher. "Oh, she's just killing it at work these days. So driven." No one questioned it, but their eyes flicked toward the empty chair at the end of the table. When the candles on the sheet cake were lit, Dad hesitated for just a moment before blowing them out. The silence in that beat said more than any wish ever could. After everyone had gone and the dishes were rinsed, Dad and I sat on the porch, watching the last of the daylight slide behind the trees. James had gone inside to help Mom clean up. Dad reached into the pocket of his cardigan and pulled out a second envelope, nearly identical to the first. He handed it to me with the same quiet weight as before. "Hold on to this one too," he said. "You'll know when." I didn't ask what was inside. I think he appreciated that. Later, I stayed out on the porch alone. The paper lanterns swayed gently overhead. I lit 2 sky lanterns, one for Dad's wish and one for mine, and watched them float above the yard, climbing past the treetops like tiny, glowing prayers. I pulled out my phone and stared at Rachel's contact. Then, without overthinking, I typed, "Dad waited for you." I hit send. The screen stayed blank for a while. Then, quietly, I turned the phone over and placed it face down on the porch railing. There's something about disappointment that doesn't shout. It just seeps. I went back inside to find James stacking the last of the paper plates into the trash. Mom was fussing with leftover potato salad. Dad was already upstairs. That night, as I was folding the throw blanket at the foot of the bed, I heard him cough. Not the usual dry sound, but something deeper, rougher, like it came from further down. James looked up from brushing his teeth. "That didn't sound good," he said. I nodded, already reaching for the phone to schedule a checkup in the morning. But even as I tapped the screen, a quiet unease settled in my chest, the kind that tells you something's shifting, even if no one said it out loud. I glanced toward the nightstand where both envelopes now sat, unopened, untouched, but not forgotten. When Eli was born, Dad cried harder than I'd ever seen, not out of joy, but something heavier, like he was carrying more than he could say, and that moment finally gave him permission to feel it. The room was too bright, too cold, and somehow still perfect. Nurses moved quietly around us, adjusting monitors and murmuring in clipped hospital shorthand. My hands were shaking from adrenaline and awe, and James sat beside me holding my shoulder like he was anchoring both of us to earth. Eli let out his first cry, loud and clear, like he already knew he had something to say. They placed him on my chest, and everything else faded. Just his tiny fists, his steady breath, the weight of him, the miracle, and the responsibility. I waited until later that evening to text Rachel. The message was short, just a photo of Eli wrapped in the hospital's striped blanket and the words, "Dad wants to meet him." I watched the little delivered icon appear under the message, but nothing more. No response, no read receipt, just another digital echo. Dad arrived the next morning. James met him at the curb and wheeled him inside while I cradled Eli near the window. I could see the moment Dad spotted us. His hand reached for the pocket of his coat like he might be searching for something to hold on to. When he finally sat beside the bed, I placed Eli into his arms. He held him like he was memorizing every detail. "You brought him home to me," Dad whispered, stroking Eli's cheek with one trembling finger. "You gave me something I didn't know I was still waiting for." I swallowed the lump in my throat. Linda stood behind him, silent, arms crossed tightly like she was bracing herself. She didn't ask to hold the baby. She just watched. Dad looked back at me and added, "Don't let guilt make you small, Emily. Don't do that to yourself." I knew what he meant, even if no one else in the room did. It wasn't about motherhood. It was about Rachel. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the hospital halls had quieted to a low hum, I sat up in bed and pulled the first envelope from my overnight bag, the one he gave me that Christmas 4 years ago. It had been sitting unopened in my nightstand drawer for far too long. Now, with Eli asleep in his bassinet beside me, it finally felt like the right time. The paper was soft from age but uncreased. Inside was a folded letter in Dad's handwriting, firm but fading. "Emily, if you're reading this, then something important has happened. I won't pretend I know what. I only know that one day you'll feel alone enough to question your worth. And I want to speak into that space before it gets too loud. You've spent your whole life standing in the background, quietly keeping this family afloat. And I see you. Rachel's absence, her distance, is not your fault, not your burden. She's always run from the messes she makes. You were never the reason she left. Please stop carrying that weight. Some truths live longer than the people who hold them, and this one should outlive me. You are not a placeholder. You are the heart of this family. With love, Dad." I cried then. Not the hospital tears of post-birth exhaustion, but something older, deeper. Grief for all the years I'd made myself smaller so someone else could shine, and relief that, at least to him, I had been enough. The next few days passed in a fog of feedings, diaper changes, and texts from friends. Linda came by once with a casserole and stayed just long enough to comment that Eli had Rachel's nose, then left before I could correct her. Dad visited twice more. Each time he seemed a little thinner. He didn't eat much, and his cough came more often. On the last visit, he stayed just long enough to hold Eli and kiss the top of my head. "Take care of them," he told James softly after I stepped out of the room to warm a bottle. "Watch over them both." James only told me that later. He didn't want to worry me. But I was already worried. I had been since that cough started nearly a year ago. One night, after Eli had gone down early and James had fallen asleep on the couch with a parenting book across his chest, I sat at the kitchen table with a pen and a notepad. The house was still, the kind of stillness that makes you reflect on everything at once. I began drafting a letter to Eli, just in case. I didn't know what I would say yet, but I knew I wanted to leave him something real, something that would tell him who he came from, not just our names, but our choices, our silences, our truths. Because sometimes what's unsaid can echo louder than anything else. Dad passed away just before sunrise. I was there, holding his hand, but he wasn't really there anymore. His breathing had softened around 3 in the morning, and by 5, it was just the hush of the oxygen tank filling the space where he used to be. I didn't cry right away. Grief, I've learned, doesn't always enter through the front door. James stood in the hallway leaning against the wall in quiet reverence. And Linda started making lists. Funeral home, casket, flowers, obituary. All said aloud like a grocery run. I wanted to believe it was her way of coping, but it felt more like redirecting. The second envelope sat on our kitchen table at home, the one he'd handed me after his 65th birthday, almost 3 years earlier, still sealed. I'd moved it from drawer to drawer over the months, unsure what moment would warrant opening something marked only "You'll know when." I didn't know yet, but I could feel it approaching. The next morning, Rachel arrived. She pulled up in a black SUV I didn't recognize. Designer sunglasses, a stiff black coat that still had the creases from the hanger, and a paper cup of iced coffee in her hand. I watched from the window as she stepped out slowly, pausing just long enough to adjust her coat like she was walking onto a stage. She hadn't been home in over a year, hadn't visited while Dad got thinner, weaker, quieter. But now she was here, 30 hours late, telling Linda on the front porch how devastated she was and how her phone had completely died on the flight. She used that word, devastated, 3 times before she stepped inside. I didn't say anything when she hugged me in the living room. Her arms were cold, like her coat had soaked up too much air conditioning and not enough presence. She sniffed. I didn't know how bad it had gotten. I looked at her for a moment, not angry, not surprised, just tired. You didn't ask, I said, and walked past her to join James in the kitchen. We met with Father Gabriel that afternoon at the funeral home. The lobby smelled like eucalyptus and old hymnals. A screensaver of a mountain sunset looped on a dusty monitor behind the front desk. Father Gabriel greeted us with a gentle nod and a clipboard of forms. He had a soft voice, the kind that made even death sound manageable. As we sat down, Rachel immediately began talking. I'd like to speak at the service, she said, setting her coffee down on the table beside the guest book samples. Something personal, just from the heart. Linda nodded quickly as if she'd been waiting for Rachel to offer. Of course, sweetie, you should. You're his daughter. I didn't correct her. Father Gabriel looked at me. Emily, would you like to say a few words as well? I shook my head. I'll let Rachel handle it. James shifted slightly in his chair beside me, but he didn't say anything. He knew I wasn't agreeing. I was waiting. That night, after Eli had gone to bed and James fell asleep on the couch with his arm draped across a quilt, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The second envelope lay in front of me. My fingers hovered over the seal for a while before I finally opened it. It was shorter than the first letter, just a single page, no greeting, no farewell. She will cry. She will perform. She will tell stories loud enough to cover what she never did. Let her, if you must. But if she turns her grief into fiction, into something that rewrites the truth, then hand this burden to someone else. You've carried enough. There was no signature, just his handwriting at the bottom, tilted, careful, fading. I read the letter 3 times before folding it back into the envelope. Then I stared at the ceiling for a long while. Somewhere down the hall, Eli shifted in his crib, a soft, sleepy whimper. I closed my eyes and listened, trying to remember the sound of Dad's voice when he used to read me bedtime stories. It had the same quiet cadence as this letter. Director, unshaken, kind, even when firm. The next morning, I watched Rachel rehearse in the guest room mirror. I stood in the hallway just long enough to hear her practice her eulogy aloud. He never got to meet his grandson, she said dramatically, hands clutched at her chest like a Playhouse Juliet. And you know why. I backed away before she could see me. That was the moment I knew. I wouldn't speak at the service, but I would not stay silent either. Some truths don't need to be shouted. They only need to be handed to someone with a microphone. She never even let him meet his grandson, Rachel sobbed at the pulpit, her voice cracking just enough to echo across the vaulted ceiling. The entire church turned to me. It happened slowly, like a ripple through still water. First the front pews, then the second, then the back. Some looked confused, some startled. 1 or 2 seemed hungry for scandal, their eyes wide with interest. Dad's final letter crinkled in my coat pocket like it had come alive, like it knew its moment had arrived. I hadn't planned to pull it out so soon, but I hadn't planned on Rachel turning a eulogy into theater either. The church was cold that morning, colder than it should have been for a February day in Raleigh. The candles lining the aisle flickered more from drafts than reverence. The stained glass windows glowed weakly in the pale gray light. Outside, I could hear the occasional rush of a passing car, the normal world continuing just beyond the sanctuary walls. Inside, time had stopped, or maybe bent. Rachel stood at the front in a black fitted coat, her hair swept back like she was attending a gala, not a funeral. She clutched a folded sheet of paper in her right hand and dabbed at imaginary tears with the other. "I just wish he could have seen Eli," she said. "Held him, heard him laugh. But some people," her voice hardened as she looked at me directly, "made sure that never happened." There it was, the accusation dressed in grief, a lie delivered as lament. Linda's face was pale. She looked down at her lap, twisting a tissue between her fingers until it tore. Father Gabriel, seated just behind Rachel, kept his gaze neutral, though his brows tightened slightly at the corners. I didn't move, not right away. My heart pounded in my chest like it was knocking on the inside of my ribs, begging me to speak, but I waited until Rachel finished. "Dad deserved more than silence," she concluded, her voice trembling, "and he deserved more than one daughter pretending she knew what he needed." That was enough. I stood. Chairs shifted. A soft collective intake of breath passed through the room. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I walked down the aisle with measured steps, past the casket draped in white lilies, past Linda, who didn't meet my gaze, and stopped in front of Father Gabriel. From my coat pocket, I pulled the envelope. The paper was warm now, pressed against me for the last hour like it had absorbed the weight of what it was about to carry. I handed it to him. He looked at it, then at me. I gave a small nod. He opened it slowly, carefully, like he already sensed it wasn't an ordinary message. Then, in the same steady tone he'd used to lead the prayers earlier, he read aloud. "If this is being read at my service, then something has gone wrong. I never asked for a perfect daughter. I never expected constant calls or grand gestures, but I did hope for presence, for effort. Rachel, I know you'll speak today. You've always had a way with words, but words are not presence, and tears do not equal time. You missed my birthday, my illness, the birth of your nephew. Not once, not by accident. You chose other things. I forgave that. But I will not allow you to rewrite history just because the ink has dried. To the one who stayed, this truth is yours now. Don't let it be erased. Thomas Carson." The room fell silent, truly silent. Not the kind of silence that follows a prayer or a song, but the kind that comes when something holy or terrible has just unfolded and no one knows what to do with it. Rachel's hands trembled. The paper she'd been holding dropped to the floor like it had lost its script. Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked at Linda, but Linda didn't reach for her. Instead, she stared at the floor, the tissue still shredded between her fingers. A whisper stirred in the pews. I caught fragments. Was that real? And she lied? And one soft voice near the back. I always wondered. Rachel turned on her heel and stormed down the aisle, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Her coat swirled behind her like the curtain falling at the end of an act. I didn't watch her go. Father Gabriel closed the letter gently and placed it back into the envelope before returning to his seat. He didn't say anything more. Linda stood slowly. For a moment, she just stood there, as if unsure which direction her loyalty pointed. Then quietly, she followed Rachel out the side door. I sat back down beside James, who took my hand and squeezed it once. Eli stirred in his stroller, making a soft sound that barely reached the front rows. I leaned over and touched his blanket, smoothing it gently. Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive with thunder. It doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be read aloud, once, and left to echo in the silence. 3 months later, I got a voicemail from Mom. "Rachel wants to talk," her voice said softly. "She's been having a hard time. She wants to reconnect." I listened to exactly 3 words before I pressed delete. The air smelled like salt and jasmine that morning, carried in on a breeze that drifted through our open kitchen window. Wilmington had a gentler rhythm than Raleigh, softer edges, quieter streets, fewer ghosts. Spring had arrived with sunshine and the sound of wind chimes dancing down the block. Eli sat on the floor with a box of crayons, his legs crossed, tongue poking out slightly as he concentrated on a piece of construction paper. I sipped coffee at the table, watching him from behind the rim of my mug. He looked up and beamed. "Look, Mama, Grandpa's fishing!" I leaned over to see the drawing. 2 figures, one small, one tall, on a pier made of squiggly brown lines. The taller one held a rod that bent toward a big orange scribble, which I decided was a fish. Overhead, Eli had drawn a sun with lines that touched every corner of the page. I didn't expect it to hit so hard. My throat tightened, but I smiled. "That's beautiful, sweetheart." He nodded, pleased with himself, then went back to adding tiny blue birds above the water. James walked in with his laptop tucked under one arm. "Library shift today?" he asked, leaning in to kiss my forehead. "Just until noon," I said. "Mrs. Finley's covering the afternoon story hour." He smiled. "You're their favorite, you know. Eli and the toddlers." I shrugged, but it warmed me. Teaching part-time at the public library wasn't what I imagined doing at 29, but it fit. I read stories, organized crafts, and shelved books while Eli stayed with James or Miss Rita, the neighbor 2 doors down. Our life wasn't flashy, but it was whole. After they left for the park, I pulled out my notebook, the one I'd started the night I wrote to Eli in the hospital, when Dad held him for the first time. The pages were worn now, edges curled, some corners marked with sleepy milk stains or my own tears. I flipped to a fresh sheet and began writing. "Eli, some people believe family is defined by names and history, but I've learned it's something quieter. Family is who listens when you whisper, who stays when it's inconvenient, who tells you the truth, even when it hurts. Grandpa wasn't perfect, but he showed up. And in the end, he chose to speak for the one who stayed, not the one who made excuses. You'll hear different versions of the same story one day. People will say things because they need to believe them, but you'll have these words and you'll have mine. Not because I want you to pick sides, but because I want you to know that silence isn't always kindness. Sometimes love means protecting your peace, even from your past." I paused. The pen hovered over the page for a moment, then I set it down. Through the open window, I could hear gulls calling from the beach and a distant squeal of laughter, maybe Eli's. Later that afternoon, while he napped, I placed both of Dad's letters and my journal entries into a small wooden box James had built in the garage. He stained it a soft cherry color and lined it with blue felt. On the top, I carved one word with my wood burner: Eli. I tucked it onto the highest shelf in the nursery closet, not for secrets, but for safekeeping. That evening, as we walked along the shore behind our house, Eli picked up seashells and asked if they talked like in the cartoons. James carried our towels and I let the water lap at my ankles. Out of nowhere, Eli looked up at me. Was Grandpa proud of me? I stopped walking. The sky behind him was a soft blend of peach and lavender. I crouched to meet his eyes and brushed a sandy curl off his forehead. "More than you'll ever know," I said. He grinned and went back to chasing waves. When we got home, the sun was dipping low. I rinsed off our feet on the porch and laid out his shells to dry. As James tucked Eli into bed, I walked into the living room, picked up my phone and held it in my hand. One missed call, another voicemail from Mom. I powered the phone off and set it face down on the table. Then I stepped outside, barefoot, into the fading light. The wind was soft against my face. For the first time in a long while, there was no ringing in my ears, no waiting for the next apology that never came, no explaining away someone else's cruelty just because they shared my blood. Just sunlight and quiet, and the boy upstairs dreaming of fishing with someone who had always, quietly, chosen him. There's a special kind of silence that comes not from losing someone, but from finally letting go of who they wanted you to be. Standing in the sunlight that day, with my son upstairs and the ocean breathing just beyond the dunes, I felt the quiet peace my father always hoped I'd find. Sometimes, family is not the one we're born into, but the one we choose to build through honesty, presence, and care. Letting go doesn't mean bitterness. It means making room for better love. As my father once said, peace isn't the absence of noise. It's the absence of pretending. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share your reflections or memories of someone who helped you feel seen. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, I'd be honored to have you along the journey.